In my beginning watercolor tip number 9, Liquid and Adhesive Masking Part 1, I demonstrated some of the masking techniques that I've incorporated into my painting process. Now in my beginning watercolor tip number 10, I'm going to put some of these techniques to use. I've sketched a very basic landscape with some simple tree and rock shapes, and I'm going to use the various masking techniques to do a simple watercolor study. So I'm taking some clear packing tape and I'm putting it across the rock shapes which I've drawn. My intent here is to mask the rock shapes, the positive shapes of the rock shapes, not the negative space around them. So I've applied the tape, and I'm going to take a sharp knife and lightly cut the packing tape to outline the shape of the rocks. You need to apply enough pressure for the blade to cut the tape, but you don't want to go so hard that you dig deep into your paper. It might scratch a little bit here or there, but if you're careful, you can cut the shape out of the tape and remove it without any issues. Once I've cut my shape out of the tape, I'll use the tip of the knife and stick it under the edge of the tape somewhere and just pull it up. Now, many times if I was doing this type of a painting this size, I probably wouldn't use this technique for this, but for this example I'm going to. In most instances I'd probably just paint around these rocks. So for this example, on the set of rocks on the left I have masked to protect them, and then the ones on the right I'm just going to leave unmasked, and I'm going to paint around them so you can see the two approaches. I'm going to use the same technique on a few of these larger tree shapes. I'm putting the packing tape in the direction of the tree to make it easy, as opposed to going across them. There are times when I might tape off a whole page and then cut out the shapes that I want. But in this instance, I know specifically that I'm going to cut these tree shapes out. So I've put them parallel and on top of the tree shapes. And I'm coming in as I did before on the rocks, and I'm going to cut out the tree shapes that I want to protect. When doing larger shapes such as these tree or the rocks, and this is on a quarter sheet of watercolor paper, I feel I use this more when I'm doing full sheet watercolors, because one of the best ways to do masking on larger shapes is with a frisket. You can buy frisket paper which is designed specifically for this purpose. You can do your outline your drawing on it, cut it out, and it has an adhesive that's designed for that. The one drawback to that is it can get pretty costly. So to me this is an economic solution to use and apply as a frisket. When doing larger areas, a frisket works much better than using liquid masking fluid. Liquid masking fluid will tend to buckle the paper and kind of has a undesirable effect on it when you're doing large areas. Not to mention it gets very costly. So a frisket is a good solution, and I find that using packing tape is both cost effective and it's an effective process to use. Next, I'm going to use a squeeze bottle that I filled myself with liquid masking fluid. And again, to me this is more economical than buying the pre-configured squeeze bottles and masking fluid pens, although I do use those because I think when I need a very precise bead of masking fluid, they have a much finer tip. But this was quite effective. It puts down a nice bead, and when I buy a bigger bottle of mask and fill this myself, it's much more cost effective. So here I'm using masking fluid now on these tree shapes, but they're not quite as big as the other ones, and I'll put down a bead of the masking fluid, and then I'll come back in with this little tool I have, a color shaper, and help distribute that. So I kind of outline the tree, then I just squiggle a bead in the middle of the tree, And then I come back in with this rubber tipped color shaper, and I just spread it within the boundary that I've laid with the bead on either side of that tree. So I've done all the narrow tree shapes, and now I'm applying a little bit of masking fluid just by dipping this color shaper in a jar. And I put some on the rock, and I'm also going to take it, and you can, if you have the right shape of a color shaper here, mine is like a wedge, you can just kind of write with it and draw lines with it. So I'm using these thin lines of masking fluid to suggest that there's branches here in the background and the foreground. Just as I did with my rubber tip color shaper, I can also take my squeeze bottle and give the suggestion of limbs. If you're doing a lot of them, this is probably the easiest method. So I'm just giving the suggestion in this watercolor landscape kind of a study. There's a suggestion that there's a lot of branches back here. You've got the tree trunks, and then I'm using it to give the suggestion of some grasses or some brush coming off the ground behind the rocks and around the trees. Next, I'm going to take a toothbrush dipped in masking fluid, and I'm just going to splatter it on the work surface just to give some texture in this wooded area. So I'm doing just a typical non-snowy day with green colors and earth tones, and this is going to give me a texture in the trees and in the leaves and on the ground. And I could just as easily use the same process to suggest a snow scene. So if I were using winter snowy colors, this splatter would give me the nice effect of snow falling. And when using a toothbrush or a paintbrush, it helps if you put it in soapy water first. It helps it clean up a little bit. But I buy the cheapest toothbrush I can get my hands on. You can normally get like a 4 or 6 pack for very little amount of money. They're not maybe the best for their intended use, but they work fine for this, and you don't feel so bad when you throw them away. Here I'm taking my squeeze bottle, and I'm giving the indication of some highlights in the water, trying to indicate the current of the water. And this is actually a fine line masking pen that I'm using. So this is a pre-configured masking fluid pen, and it's got a very fine tip on it, and it does a good job when you want a very fine line. And I'm using it here again just to indicate some branches. So I'm trying to show you as many ways to do some of these effects as I can. And now that I've put all these different methods of masking to use, it's time to begin applying some paint. So this is going to be a watercolor study of a landscape, and I've got a fairly decent sized wash brush. I could be using a bigger one still, but this will do the trick. And I'm just working in some earth tones here, some green, some sap green with a little pyro red mixed in. And I'm being very liberal and loose as I apply this wash. And because of all the masking work I've done, I don't have to worry too much about painting around any of the shapes so much. It's just a nice big wash with some gradation of color, and later there'll be some more gradation of value. But this is a nice middle value that I'm laying down, and it'll be a good starting wash for this study. As I apply this paint, you can see the various masking methods come through the wash that I'm putting down. You can see where I've taped, and you can see the splatter and the branch shapes that I've indicated by using a squeeze bottle or using the rubber tip color shaper to draw a line. And here I'm painting around those masked rocks, and as I come over towards the other side of the composition, as I said, I didn't mask these rocks, so I'm just going to paint around those. And that's probably what I would do if I were working on this size of a painting and putting on this type of a wash. But either method will work very effectively for you. The nice thing about using the masking as opposed to painting around all these shapes is you can do this nice big gradated wash without having to pick up on one edge, stop on one edge and pick up on the other edge. It just gives a nice continuation and gives a suggestion that it's in the background moving behind, and you have the overlap, and it just has nice continuity to the wash that sometimes can be hard to get when you're painting around, although you can still achieve the same results. You just have to use more care and be a little bit more deliberate in your application of the paint. Now I'm going to come in with more of a bluish green tone to give the indication of some water here. And you can see that this is painted very quickly because I did a lot of the work up front with my masking, and I've laid down this wash very quickly and have covered probably 3/4 of the work surface. So I've dried my paper thoroughly, and I still have all my masking in place, and I'm coming in now with a darker value, and this is going to help push some of these shapes, the tree shapes and the rock shapes, forward and send the background back a little bit, start to give a little bit more dimension to this painting. Here I'm using my brush, hitting it against my finger just to give a little splatter and some dark valued texture that's going to work in conjunction with the mask that I also splattered on there. So it repeats this texture but in a darker value, where the masking fluid is going to show the same type of a texture, but it's going to be light and white value. Applying this darker wash in the areas around the trees, and now I'm coming in with a spray bottle, and I can soften the edges, diffuse that color, and let it flow throughout the composition. And because I have all these masking applications in place, it protects the white of the page and lets this paint flow all around those shapes without impacting them at all. I'm using a fine point quill brush here to make some dark valued linear shapes here that represent branches or twigs, and I'm doing this before I lift the masking fluid because it gives the impression of these lines going behind the areas that are masked and helps create overlap, which gives some dimension to the composition. Now I'm going to start to remove my masking. So I'm beginning to remove the packing tape first, and you can see that it's left those shapes with just the plain paper showing through. It's completely protected. I'm taking the plastic or the tape off the rocks there, and now I'll start removing the liquid mask that has dried on the paper. And to do that, I'll use this rubber cement pickup eraser. As I remove the dried masking fluid, you can see all the white shapes that have been preserved, and the textures, the branches that I drew, and the splatter that where I splattered masking fluid with a toothbrush. You can start to see all those highlights in white areas start to be revealed. Now that all my masking is removed, I'm going to come in and start to put some light to middle value washes over some of these shapes. So I want to give the suggestion on these trees that they're shadowed, and you have to be careful when you do this amount of masking that you work to get these shapes to blend in with the rest of your composition, and you don't want them to look like they were cut out and pasted on. I'm taking some of these washes and taking the same tone from between the trees and bringing them over to create some shadowed areas, and again trying to help these blend in with the rest of the composition and make them feel like all these shapes are part of the same composition. And I'm going to take the spray bottle and soften some edges and spray the wash so that it diffuses that color over top the shapes and helps them blend in. So there's the finished landscape study, and the focus of this video wasn't the painting but the various masking techniques that I use, and different ways that you could use them in a composition, or in this case a landscape. Liquid mask and adhesive mask can be an efficient and effective tool to incorporate in your painting process, but try not to get too gimmicky with them, and use them when you feel it's the best tool to get the job done. I hope after watching part 1 and part 2 of my masking tutorials, you not only have a better understanding of what some of the options are for masking, but you also have a better idea of how you might incorporate those in your painting process. As always, I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for watching.